Hello, my loves. Hello, hello, hello. My name is Dustina. This is Boujee Astrology, and we're going to do a meditative rant video about the history of Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. You've heard the line before, history repeats itself. But what we don't take into consideration is that when history is repeating itself, there is a transit behind it. There is astrology behind it. And when certain transits repeat themselves, they too show a pattern of behavior that has a way of grabbing the masses, grabbing people. And in this case, we're going to focus on Saturn and Neptune. Now, I like to call Saturn Daddy Saturn. He is laws, he is rules, he is the government, he is elements of enforcement, he is the responsible party. Whenever I explain him as an individual, I always picture like Red Foreman from that 70s show. Like, he's super steadfast. He gives you an inch, you take it miles. And then whenever he has to clean up the mess, what does he do? He calls everybody a dumbass and then he fixes the mess. Very Saturnian energy, very dad like energy. Good old daddy Saturn. Laws, rules, boundaries, government. Put a pin in that. We're adding Neptune. Lies, fraud, deception, negative energies of Neptune. Positive energies of Neptune has to do with our belief system, our spirituality, our religion, our faith. We're going to come back to that part. If it's not about these things, then there can be other types of effects that impact the body. And I've already seen the first waves of how certain people have been dealing with the physical elements of Neptune's energy. And for those of you that keep coming around saying, my anxiety is on high and I don't know why, it is a physical effect of Neptune right now because Neptune just moved into Aries. And it's also the physical effect of what these two planets are doing together. Now, I have a funny way to describe Neptune and how I've personally dealt with Neptune. So, over the last few years, while Neptune has been going through Pisces, me personally, I have had Neptune go through a square with my natal Saturn, hit a conjunction to my natal moon, hit a square to my natal sun, a square, excuse me, to my natal Mercury, my natal Chiron, not in this order. And right now, February 5th, right now with Saturn, not Saturn, with Neptune at 0 degrees of Aries, it is in a perfect square to my natal Mars in Cancer. And my Mars energy is like very super aware of like, we can't let the fueling and the rose colored glasses completely engulf us because if it does and we get completely grabbed by the energy, shit's going to go wrong. And I'm in a really cussy mood. I'm very, very sorry. It's going to slip up every once in a while. I've been cussing all day, more so than I normally do. It's just where I'm at right now. I apologize. I'm just letting you know that because I just did the first one. I have personally been dealing with how this planet has impacted parts of my natal chart. With some of you, whenever I've done your individual readings, I have told you, like when you start to feel these energies, like the way he comes through is like the Tasmanian devil, except for there's no devil. Think about the Tasmanian devil. Think of your Looney Tunes cartoons. Think of the wild animal that once it gets to spinning, all of like this ravaging fog that comes through and it grabs the bunny or it grabs the duck. We'll just stick with the duck for a minute. And as the Tasmanian devil goes through, it completely strips elements of the duck away. And when the Tasmanian devil is gone, the foggy cloud whirlwind is gone. What do you see is a beak facing the other way, misstrown parts of the feathers, and the duck picking everything back up. Good old Daffy. As he starts to put his feathers back in, he has to take account as to whether this was a good thing to do or not. He has to really take certain measurements. Neptune has this way of coming through and dissolving beliefs, fueling beliefs, dissolving how things have been done, how things have happened, while creating new ones. But we don't do it in a fast series of energy. Neptune is a very slow moving planet, as too is Saturn. Now, over the last few years, we've been building to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And over the last few years, we have seen a shift in beliefs and fueling around a multitude of areas. And I keep saying there's a fueling in our beliefs that have been coming through. But so many people, when I'm saying that to you, you have no idea. Like it doesn't, you're deer in headlights. The comprehension isn't there. So we need a definition. Now, before I show the definition, here's full disclosure. We are going to be jumping between Google, we are going to be jumping between Wikipedia, and we are going to be jumping between charts for very specific reasons. And I will have to tie some things together, but there are reasons for all of it. I didn't do some type of like slideshow or anything like that. If one of y'all want to do a slideshow, that's great. I don't have time for all that. I already did this part of the research. Give me a break. Going first. Going to Google. Don't judge me with how many windows are open because we're going to talk about all of them. By definition, a belief system is a set of principles or tenets which together form the basis of a religion, of philosophy, or a moral code. Your internal compass of knowing the difference between right and wrong have to do with the way a belief system has been indoctrinated into you. It is a code. Generationally speaking, the belief system of somebody born in the 1950s is not going to be the same as somebody born in the 1990s, and it's not going to be the same as somebody born today. It is not. Astrologically, there are reasons that support this. And as we continue to go through all of these different timelines of previous Saturn-Neptune conjunctions and what they did to people, this is going to make sense. It is. You just got to go with me for a while. And it is going to get a little bit messy because, again, I'm jumping between like Wikipedia, Google, and the charts. So there's that. And we're going to talk about a couple different timelines. One in particular, we have to go really far back because it is the timeline that actually most mimics today's. Then we're going to jump forward to the 1800s. We're going to talk about two different big things that was going on specifically in the 1880s during that Saturn-Neptune conjunction timeframe. We're going to have a lot of emphasis on Russia, aka formerly known as the Soviet Union. And what you're going to see is there's a lot of things when Saturn-Neptune does its dance that it really impacts Russia. And historically, you're going to see why. I will show you all of it. Then there's going to be a lot of the things tied to the 1950s. We're going to do a little bit about the 1989, 1990 timeframe, and then we're going to tie a bunch of that into present energy. My notes are just independent little segues of reminding me to go to the next topic. Whatever is coming out of my mouth is exactly that. It's coming out at that time because I feel like that's the right thing to say. If you are a history buff, you're probably going to enjoy this. If you're one of those people that you're just trying to understand what the hell's going on in the world, this might help a little bit, but you're going to have to pay attention. And there's going to be some things that I might say that might go over your heads just a little bit, but hey, I answer questions. I answer the comments when it's necessary. Not everybody gets an answer, by the way, because sometimes they're ridiculous, but I do read them, every single one. Y'all don't know that, but I do. Okay. So first things first, that belief system. It is fair to say, before we get into the full breakdown of everything, and I will recap this at the end, that if there is a dissolving effect, a Tasmanian devil effect, around what Neptune does, there will be certain dissolutions around what Saturn rules. And again, Saturn is rules, Saturn is law, Saturn is boundaries, quite literally boundaries. If you have a plot of land, the bounds of the platting of your neighborhood, of where your house sits in the neighborhood, of where your neighborhood sits within the city, these are bounds upon bounds upon bounds. This is Saturn upon Saturn upon Saturn. And for some people, there will be dissolution, dissolving, a strange, mysterious effect of redrawing lines because who should be in control of this? Now that seems like I'm really trying to make some kind of ploy in the present day. I'm not. I'm going to go off to history and show you what has happened historically, especially whenever we had our previous Saturn-Neptune timeframe in Aries. But before we can fully understand the actual conjunction time frame, we have to know what was going on beforehand. So we're going to start in the 1700s. And we had 3 wars that were going on simultaneously, 2 of which I'm going to have a bigger focus on. One I'm bringing up because it's Russia. And we're going to have a real heavy emphasis of the Russian history whenever we get into the 1800s and the 1900s. But there was a great big war going on in Russia in the early 1700s, along with the other 2 that we will put more focus on. So I'm making everybody aware of that. So the first war is the War of Spanish Succession. Now, the reason we had a War of Spanish Succession is because the monarchies for centuries were all cousins marrying each other. And they didn't know it back then, but by not broadening up your gene pool, they were doing negative things to their family tree. Cousins marrying cousins marrying cousins. Now, with what we know about DNA and everything else scientifically, we realize why there were so many issues. But the War of Spanish Succession specifically had to do with when Charles II of Spain died without being able to have an heir. Now, the thing is, his health was so poor through his life because, again, inbreeding, he couldn't even father a child. So even though he was married, because he didn't really get a choice in the matter, he was betrothed, that's how it went back then, nothing ever happened. So he died without an heir. And it was the end of the Habsburg dynasty. I was going to say the wrong H for just a second, over Spain. And what happened was we had 2 different distant cousins that suddenly had the most rightful claim, but their claim was pretty equal. One was from Austria, and the other was from France. And the thing is, you have to understand what was going on in the decade before, so in the 1690s, to understand why this war was so important. And in the 1690s, there was what was called the American gold rushes. Now, historically speaking, they actually call it the Brazilian gold rush, but the thing is, it was coming from Mexico, it was coming from the South American countries, it was coming from North American countries. It was a rush to have ownership, to claim ownership, a belief that ownership was necessary in the name of whatever monarchy was in charge of whatever territory, that they needed to seize control and power. Well, one of the top countries that had been going over areas of Mexico, Venezuela, other areas of South America, the most 2 dominant countries of those areas were Portugal and Spain. Portugal had more focus on Brazil. Some of the other Mesoamerican areas, they were Portugal was more over Brazil. The other ones were more over Spain. I think I goofed that up for just a second. I want to recap how I said that. Portugal had more control over Brazil. Most of the other Mexican, Mesoamerican areas, Spain was trying to issue control. Spain was trying to claim ownership. But there was a lot of gold. There were millions of dollars of gold, jewels, and other resources, cocoa and stuff like that, coming from the Americas. We have these new things coming in, and they were ways of making money. And the European monarchies were suddenly dubiously more richer. And nobody wanted to lose the money. Nobody wanted to lose control of that power. But if the ruler of Spain was to lean more in a different direction, because again, the 2 people that could take over were either from Austria or from France, then it can arguably create a different level of a superpower, a new superpower. But this wasn't the only war that was going on in the 1700s. In fact, again, there were 3. There was the Spanish Succession War, and the other one known as Queen Anne's War. Now, in some history books, they're going to say they're the same thing. In some ways they are, but in other ways they're not, because whenever it came to England, England was more focused on North America because it was a straighter shot for them. But there was still areas of North America where they were fighting with France as to who had control of what. So we had another level of a war still based off of who should have control of these territories, be able to gain these tax dollars, be able to have the resources to be able to make money off of who controlled these areas. We're going off history. I'm not talking about present day. I want to make that clear. Okay. So we're going to look at some time frames. We're going to go to Wikipedia for a minute, and then we're going to look at some charts because, again, we're focused on Saturn-Neptune stuff. The thing, again, about Saturn-Neptune is it's not just about the exact date of the conjunction. The timeline and the buildup with these outer planets coming together are important. The timeline of the separation of these outer planets is also very, very important. So I'm making you guys aware. Just because it's not the exact date of when Saturn Neptune comes together doesn't mean we don't still see the pattern. So we're going to go forward. We're going to pay attention. First, we're going to go over to the Google. Again, Charles II, he died in November 1st of 1700. The two candidates of succession were Charles of Austria or Philip of Anjou, which was the grandson of King Louis of France and a part of the House of Bourbon. This was resulting in a huge power dynamic. Now, this war did not start the day this man died. Please note, he died November 1st of 1700, because we're going to look at a chart for this. So I need you to understand this date to understand the chart of the next one. The War of Spanish Succession is notably noticed as starting in March of 1701. Notice there's not a specific date. Now it makes sense to me that there's not a specific date, because if you think back then, travel back then was not like what it is now. You can fly to another country in a day. You can drive 5-6 states over in a day. Back then, your fastest way of travel was by horse. So it takes time for the people of these other countries to come into Spain and for everybody to have certain conversations as to who should be doing what. And the thing is, after about 6 months, rounding it a little bit, nobody could agree which way to go. Thus, the war began. Now, we're going to go to some charts, and I want to put some stuff together. And there's going to be a lot of charts that we focus on. This is a different kind of episode. This is the death date of Charles of Spain. November 1st, 1700. He died like 5 days before his 39th birthday. And it happened during a Mercury Cazimi. This is the keynote that I want to pay attention to. This is why I actually created a chart for him. And everything that we're going to look at has this S plus N. This means Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And so I can keep everything together. Now, we're going to open this up. You're going to see a bunch of stuff. We're not focused on everything yet. We're going to go down to March 9th of 1701, roughly about 6 months later. And the reason I'm using this as the exact date, because you saw on Wikipedia, they didn't have an exact date. I'm using this as the date. I got reasons why. If Charles II died during a Mercury Cazimi, the next Mercury Cazimi that happened was this one right here. Technically speaking, the next direct Mercury Cazimi, because there was a Mercury retrograde that actually happened in this 6-month window, like in between his death and this actual time frame. But I thought it was interesting that this is the end of eclipse season. This is the first lunation that ended eclipse season. So this is a new moon, even though the moon's not exact right here. Conjunct Saturn, conjunct a Mercury Cazimi. I'm using this date for my part of the chart, but I know what you guys are thinking immediately. Dusty, that Saturn is not near Neptune. That's not a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. You're right. And again, we've had going off of the last 2 years, we had a build up to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. These little markers were in the buildup of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So let's look at something that happened a little bit closer that still falls into these time frames. And that would be the start of Queen Anne's War. Now, the reason I specifically tied all of this stuff together actually had to do with the Queen Anne part. Because whenever I started looking at transits going backwards and I found the Saturn-Neptune conjunction that happened in Aries, then I started looking at what was going on in that time frame. There was a lot of buildup, and then there was a lot of reactionary energy that followed. That's the key thing right here. So we're going to, what's the wrong button? We're going to go back to the Wikipedia. And now we're going to go over to Queen Anne. Queen Anne's War started March 8th of 1702. Now, when I started looking at this March 8th of 1702, when I get to the chart here in a minute, I'm going to make sense of something. There was more than one pattern that repeated in this time frame. But this war was started the day she ascended the throne. And this had to do with more like, again, when it came to this time frame, there was arguments as to like which territories should be ruled over by France, which are ruled over by Spain. You can see how powerful Spain was just by this part of the map. And then which ones were being ruled over by England. So there was a lot of fighting as to like who had control over what land, what tax dollars, what resources. That's important because, again, of what we're dealing with in the other sense. Now, I want to show the ascension of Queen Anne and where we have more than one pattern to the 2025 energy that repeated. Like 2025 was a repeat of that time frame in more than one way. I'm just showing you a slew of different things that all correlated to the timeline. Again, it's not always specific to the one day. But now we're actually going to get into Queen Anne's coronation date. So helps if I share the screen. Queen Anne's coronation date happened March 8th of 1702, and this was also the start of Queen Anne's War. You guys just saw that on Wikipedia. And what caught my interest here was one, where Saturn is in Pisces, 28 degrees. That's literally the day I'm recording this in the early February of 2026. That's where Saturn is right now, is at 28 degrees. Next week, he'll be at 29. He literally enters Aries, February 13th, 14th. It depends on your time zone. So I thought that was interesting. But what really caught my attention was also Venus. So I want to open this back up. I want to show you something. If we look at Venus goes retrograde roughly every 18 months. Well, if you look at the timeline of Charles of Spain, November 1700, here's Venus direct, 22 degrees, and 2 degrees away from the sun. She's behind the sun by 2 degrees. If we go with the start of Spanish War succession, we're mainly focused that it's March. I'm picking March 9th. I showed you why, I explained why. This is not the exact date that it says in the books. I understand that. But where's Venus? Venus is behind the sun, but it's one sign behind the sun. And over the course of the year, we would have had a Venus cazimi, and we get back to Queen Anne's coronation date. And now Venus is ahead of the sun. And in that whole 18-month time frame from November to this time is like, we haven't had a Venus retrograde. I bet you that Venus is stationing. If I bump this from March 8th, I bump it forward 1 month, Venus is retrograde. We had a Venus retrograde when Queen Anne took power. And as soon as she ascended to power, again, the Constitution, the English Constitution, because remember, that is a constitutional monarchy. By this time, England was a constitutional monarchy. Queen Anne did not make the choice. It was more along the lines of her dad had passed away, so Parliament could do what it wanted to do, and she took the blame. We had Queen Anne's War. We had a person go into a position of power and immediately have other people in areas of power start to do different dynamics in power under her name. Now, did she make some choices in this? I don't know. Y'all don't know either. We can guess that she had some elements. I don't know that we have a full element of her history in regards to like some of her journals and stuff like that. But I know, again, 100 years prior to her ascending the throne, literally it was 1603. So 100 years prior, that is whenever England went to a constitutional monarchy because they didn't want so much power to be just underneath the rule of the king or the queen. They wanted more rulership of government to actually have a hand in laws and policy. We're going to have another conversation about constitutional monarchies whenever we get into Russia here in a little bit. So I need y'all to be aware of this part. Certain things underneath her name got pushed forward, specifically to gain power. In 2025, we had a Venus retrograde. And in that time frame, there was new shifts in gaining power. It wasn't just America. Canada got a new president. America got a new president. Japan got a new emperor. That's still called an emperor, right? France has had multiple leader changes in the last few years. France is going through all sorts of stuff, by the way. I think it was the Swedish queen stepped down and her son took over the throne. So we've had shifts in people in positions of power all over the globe. Just so everybody's aware of that. It hasn't just been one. Now, part of the power dynamic changes of Saturn-Neptune conjunctions will continue as we go forward. And I don't want to get too tied up in that. But a lot of you are probably saying, when you showed us those two areas of the screen, Dusty, you didn't show us the exact Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And you are correct. I didn't. However, whenever we look back at that Queen Anne time frame, you'll notice over the course of that Venus retrograde, because I'm still bumped forward a month, Saturn has now entered Aries. And over the course of this year, we did go into the first rounds of the Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. And within, we also had Jupiter involved. And over the course of these early years of the 1700s, and you're going to notice we're going to have a pattern all the way through where it's not just the one date, the one time frame, it's a series of years. This is one of those transits that we have to pay attention to all of the years, forwards and backwards. Really, we can look at a 5-year window whenever it comes to the Neptune in Aries, because Neptune went into Aries in 1697. And right after that, we started going into the wars. We went into the War of Spanish Succession, Queen Anne's War, the Great Northern War. That's the one that I'm not covering, but I'm bringing a note to it. And that was the Russian war that was being done over more northern areas, not so much American territory, because they didn't look at Alaska as a resource the way that we do today. Okay. There was a lot of these wars in regards to having control and ownership. I think I went on a tangent just then. I'm sorry. But there's still a pattern. In that time frame with the Venus retrograde, there was a push to something forward. But this isn't the only time frame where we've seen a push in power that included a Venus retrograde. Now, the next one is going to be a lot more clearer than the first one. I thought it was interesting that we had this big timeline where we repeated something in the early 1700s, between 1700 and 1705, the most exact. By the time we got through with Neptune and Aries, a lot of the wars dissipated, the wars that we're talking about. They fell to the wayside. They didn't have the same fueling anymore. Neptune and Aries tends to have a fueling behind it. And that's not the only time frame that has come through. And if you've listened to previous meditative rants, I have talked about this before. The start of Saturn and Neptune back in the 1800s was the start of the American Confederate War. We're not trying to repeat this stuff, but we do still anticipate a fueling whenever it comes to Neptune and Aries, just going off of that. Now, we're going to jump forward. We're going to jump to 1800, specifically 1880, 1881 to 1882. We're going to do a little window on American history. I'm not going to get too heavy in this because I have talked about this time frame before in a previous episode regarding the Mars retrograde that happened a year ago, a little over a year ago now. arguably. I'm going to give reference to it, but then I'm going to shift gears and we're going to start going over Russia. And historically speaking, in the last 150 years, every time there's something Saturn and Neptune, there's something big with Russia. And we're going to have a big pattern around that as we continue from this point. And I'm going to remind everybody we are looking at the history to find the patterns. We're not fueling or being pro any one specific belief system. We're trying to tie some things together because I know after a while somebody's going to have their panties in a wad, and I don't really care. Okay. Now, in 1881, we had the rise of President James Garfield. James Garfield was pushed forward by the Congress to run for president in the 1880s. And the thing is, he didn't choose it. He did not go to Congress with the idea that he wanted to become president. He was going to speak on someone else's behalf, but his way of speaking, he was such a well-put orator that he literally started to sway the opinion of the entire Congress for him to literally be pushed forward as a presidential candidate. There is an awesome docudrama kind of thing that was done on Netflix in the last year that really encapsulates this. And I really love for people to actually go look at this. And I want you to kind of just know the astrology behind it too. And that is called Death by Lightning. It is about how James Garfield got pushed forward to becoming president. He actually ran on a slogan that they didn't really cover in that show, and I wish they would have covered it more. And that was part of his slogan was, we need to drain the swamp. If you have listened to me before in previous Meditative Rant videos, that's the part that's going to be the part you remember. He ran on the slogan of draining the swamp because so much of Congress was super corrupt at the time. And he wanted to get rid of corruption in Congress and actually put forth better systems for humanity, for people. Like, he wanted to do that. But he was the first president that was assassinated out of wartime. Quite literally, up until then, nobody thought that this was even an option, that somebody would try to come and assassinate a United States president out of wartime. It was just not conceivable. But then it happened to him. It was roughly around July 4th weekend of 1881. He wrestled with his gunshot wound, and he really died of dysentery because they didn't do a good job. The doctors were not doing a good job of keeping their hands clean, and they created infections inside the body of the president. And this is literally how Chester Arthur became president, was because he inherited that based off of being the vice president. And you see in this show, this is why I'm saying, go check out Death by Lightning, and note that you're watching like his entire time frame of whatever he's starting to take office, and he's making people mad, and he's meeting with all these people to try to like clean up what was going on in the Congress at the time. He ran off of a slogan called, again, we're going to drain the swamp. We've heard that in the last few years. And it did result in him getting assassinated, but it wasn't from a member of Congress. It was from somebody that was very radicalized, that had a very different fueled belief system of his own. And I don't want to get into that. So I wanted to bring up the American part, because whenever I start to go into all this Russian stuff, you're going to go, but Dusty, what were we doing? Did we not have anything? No, we absolutely did. But I have to show you, like, the Russian side is way more intense than the American side. And I'm watching Russia as we continue over the next few years with Saturn and Neptune. And now I'm going to show you why. Because I got a lot of people who are like, why aren't you concerned? It's like, I'm more concerned about a whole other area of the world. So we're still stuck in 1881. Now we're going to switch gears. We're going to go over to Russia. And we're going to talk about Alexander II of Russia. He too was assassinated in 1881, by the way. Now, we're going to have a conversation about him because of what he was trying to do. Now, he was known as the liberal czar, and he was seeing a pattern in his country of anarchists, of people that were attacking the monarchy because people were starting to really lose faith in the monarchy. And in between 1880 and 1881, he was trying to really put together reforms. And in 1881, the year he was assassinated, he was trying to transition the Russian monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. He wanted to create a more congressional parliamentary government and mirror what had been done in England, because he knew for us to continue to have a monarchy in Russia, there had to be a change. And he was pushing for that. But he was assassinated. Now we're going to look at some charts tied to him for just a minute. So, get into the charts. Alexander of Russia's death date was March 18th of 1881. Now, you're going to notice this is actually a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. He had already signed the Acts of Parliament. He had already been putting forth the reforms. They were signed and sealed, ready to start to be released to the public when he was assassinated. Isn't that crazy? Had his reforms actually happened, they would have taken effect a year later. So we're going to go from 1881 to now 1882. And what do you see in 1882? A Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Now, historically speaking, sometimes Saturn-Neptune comes through in peaceful ways. There was a hope for a peaceful way at this time. But he did not get to continue what he did. And whenever it came to his heir, he had two sons that we're going to talk about. He had more than two sons, but in this case, we're just going to talk about two. One was Nicholas, and the other was the man that became Alexander III. And the way that the monarchies taught the heirs and spares were very, very different, historically speaking. Whoever was the heir presumptive, they were the ones that had the most education. And some of the beliefs of Alexander II was more installed in his first son, Nicholas, who died before ascending the throne. So then gears were shifted to the second son, Alexander III, the one that did inherit upon the death of his father. And what did Alexander III do whenever he found out about these reforms his father was trying to push through? Oh, no, this is a terrible idea. I'm not giving up my power. We are monarchs. We're destined by God. Rip, 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 confetti. He completely demolished and abolished the reforms his father was putting into place. Had those went through, the interesting thing that happens next, we might have a Russian monarchy still to this day. We might not have had a Cold War or communism had those reforms actually been able to go through. We don't know because we never got to experience them. History shows us something very, very different. Now, there continued to be attempts on the Tsarevich. There continued to be anarchists and people that were very much against the monarchy, and fights between people and the monarchy all through Russia that continued into the 1900s. And now we're going to start to focus on the 19 teens. I'm just saying the teens, by the way. Post-World War I. Now, some of you all know that World War I was more focused on the European countries. Any Americans that were in World War I actually did it by volunteer. And America was more of a supplier through World War I. But whenever it came to the devastation of what that war did, it was more impactful in the European countries and Russia. We're going to still be focused on Russia. Between 1917 and 1918, we had the overthrowing of the monarchy and the first steps towards creating the Soviet Union. And upon the creation of the Soviet Union, especially after World War I, Also came the Iron Curtain. Now, the funny thing, funny curious, not funny haha, about that time frame is, again, had the previous Saturn Neptune got to go the way that it should have went, that was being attempted at that time, it might not have happened the way that it did. We don't know, but I think it's very curious. It's a very curious time frame. And now I wanted to pay attention to the timeline of the overthrowing of the Russian monarchy. So we're going to go from Alexander II now to, bump this down, Nikolai of Russia. Nikolai was the final czar of Russia, and he was very much strong-armed into abdicating his throne, and his people beneath him was strong-arming him, saying, you should name your son as your successor. The thing is, Nikolai wasn't stupid. He knew something was going on. And on March 15th of 1917, this was when he abdicated his throne. He was disposed from the throne. And we have the start of a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. You can see this right here. I'm going to take the ascendant off because this really doesn't matter right now. But here's Saturn 23 of Cancer. Here's Neptune 2 degrees of Leo. And over the course of the next year and a half, there were fights and tension as to, one, what to do with the Tsarevich and his family. Do they go into exile? Do we kill them? We don't know. I'm probably going to get hit by the YouTube gods and the Spotify gods by using the words that I do. So I apologize. But what do we do? What do we do? There were questions. Now, ultimately, we know what happened. They didn't survive. That happened over the course of a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So I'm going to keep this going. We're still in the same time frame. I'm still showing you guys the charts. Nikolai, this is whenever he was deposed. The death date of him and his family was July 17th of 1918. And by then, we had actually passed the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. The other thing that was happening in this time frame, and this is, it's the midpoint, was the proclamation of Soviet Russia, of creating the communist country that became known as the Soviet Union. Initially, it was Soviet Russia. After a couple more years, it became the Soviet Union, but you've heard it both ways. But historically speaking, there's actually a timeline difference between Soviet Russia and Soviet Union. And that's because the timeline difference of when some of the other additional Baltic countries were absorbed into the Soviet Union. But in this case, strictly talking about Russia. The proclamation of when communism started to go into effect in Soviet Russia was in this 1917 timeframe, in a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Now, again, was this the exact date? No. Is it the time frame? Yes. With this particular transit, we don't just look at the exact date, we look at the time frame. And in this 2-year span, there was a huge shift in power, removing the Russian monarchy and creating the first wave of the Soviet Union. But please note how I said first wave. There were multiple waves of different belief systems of communism that embellished parts of Russia. Marxist communism, Leninism communism, and Stalinism communism. Joseph Stalin became one of the biggest leaders through the Soviet Union in between this Saturn-Neptune conjunction and the one that happened in the 50s. And most specifically, he died during the next one. So we're going to go back to the charts. We're going to look at the dates. Again, Joseph Stalin's death date. We're not worried about his birthday. It is his death date. 1953, we have a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Libra. Look at that. Now, I want to talk about the 50s for a little bit because we like to idealize the 50s quite a bit whenever it comes to this time frame. So I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. We're going to talk about some of the Russian stuff because whenever Stalin died, there was a huge time frame of like, Stalin was infamous for the things that he did to people. And there were mass deaths under his watch, under his rulership. He had no care. Historically speaking, he was also super, super paranoid, did horrible things to his family, not a great person, did crazy things on behalf of the Soviet Union. Not going to get too far into that because it's not about that part. It's more looking at the shift of power that happened, because there was a true difference in how communism continued after this standpoint than before this standpoint. Because 1953 was, again, another Saturn-Neptune conjunction time frame. But there was shifts in different belief systems in more than one area of the world. And now I want to talk about the American part for just a little bit, and then we'll go back to some of the Russian stuff and back to America. We're going to just jump around a little bit. In the 1950s, we had what I like to call the nuclear delusion. The nuclear delusion. The nuclear family of the 1950s. Everybody should have the cute little house with the white picket fence, the 2 kids, the car, the dog, and it's wonderful. And the wife just sits at home and does all her motherly duties. And this is what TV shows were based off of. Like, seriously, think about it. Go watch shows from the 1950s. This was the premise of so many of it. Okay, Leave It to Beaver. There you go. There was a propaganda of what America should look like that was being broadcast through televisions at the time, that we wanted to spread a belief system that this is what America was made of. The problem is, this is not what America was made out of. We had huge problems with segregation. We had a huge issue with different beliefs. And we also had a lot of ploys around the Cold War. Now, of course, that's going back into some of the Russia stuff. But what's funny is the rise of James Bond came through the 1950s. And so too did the term by any means necessary. And that seems to be a very interesting way to look at a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Because again, Saturn is these rules and these laws and boundaries. But when it comes to the arts of trying to maintain power, sometimes the rules get thrown out the window. And you have that Neptune vibration. In the 1950s, most specifically in 1953, Ian Fleming wrote his first book about James Bond, The Casino Royale. Now, there have been other people that have written books about James Bond, but the birth of James Bond, 1953. There's a fun little fact for you. The other thing that we had going on in the 1950s, I'm playing the James Bond thing in there because of all the spy things, but there was a lot of paranoia in the 1950s. And we also had another time period known as McCarthyism, where Senator McCarthy was vehemently against communism. And he would literally arrest people, bring them to Congress, put people on trial, and throw them into prisons if they had any beliefs that could be dictated as socialism or communism. Because anyone that would believe these things would have to be a spy. That's where the whole spy thing came from, by the way. Just tying that little note together. They had to be a spy. The only way you could believe in these kinds of things would be because you are a spy for them. God forbid somebody had some level of a belief that there should be equalness among people. I'm not pushing an agenda. I'm more along the lines of I support the understanding of different belief systems. But the radicalism of the time was, if you're not for the nuclear family, the American propaganda that this is what life should be, then you're against it. And therefore you must be a spy. I thought it was interesting that James Bond was created during this time because of all the concepts around believing so many people were hidden agents. They were double agents, triple agents, and most specifically agents that would be between the United Nations, because it wasn't just America. It was also England. It was also France. So the United Nations versus Russia. There was a lot of emphasis around this agenda. And there was a very big fueling that if you didn't believe a certain way, you were wrong. You were wrong. You can't believe anyway, but the way that we believe, because we are Americans. And I want people to understand the fueling of that propaganda vibration, because that concept became so ingrained that it literally followed Americans for decades. You've heard the term the nuclear family. You've heard the term the white picket fence. It is carried for decades past the time frame that it was. That's why I call the 1950s the nuclear delusion, because we were very deluded to believe that everything was sunshine and rainbows post World War II. There were problems. There were a lot of problems. But there was this fueling around belief systems from that time frame. Now, I want to go to a more present in most of our lifetimes, most of my listeners. Some of y'all, you were alive in the 50s. I know you were because we've talked before, but it's not about that. Some of you guys, your parents were the 1950s people, and you were taught the same level of indoctrined propaganda that they were taught. So you had the first hand down, like, no, this is supposed to be your goal. This is the American dream. Ah, yeah, that's also from that same time frame. The American dream. This is what we're all supposed to want. This is what we're all supposed to go for. This is what we're supposed to do. Huh. So funny how that has fell away. Now, we're going to go into a more present time frame. And that still is going to cover parts of Russia, but we're also going to have a more up-to-date time frame to think about. And that actually goes to the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we're going to fast forward this. Let's go back to the charts. We're going to get rid of Stalin. We're done with him. We're going to focus on the fall of the Berlin Wall. November 9th of 1989. I have it dummied in at noon. Of course, this is in Berlin because it was the Berlin Wall. And what do we want to look at? Right here in Capricorn. Saturn 10 degrees 0, Neptune 10 degrees 15. The fall of the Berlin Wall was believed to be the first fall of the Iron Curtain and the first fall of communist Russia. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a very peaceful vibration towards literally taking down the wall that was built through the center of Berlin, Germany, separating one side of Germany as a communist side to the other side being more capitalistic. It's not necessarily just American or anything like that, but it was like the two different doctrines. And Berlin really became a hot spot for many, many years of like showing the dire difference between the two different concepts of the nations of the world, especially the Cold War era of things. And whenever the wall fell in Berlin, it was believed to be the proof that capitalism won, the belief that other people had fell into and that communist was horrible. I'm not saying that it wasn't. I'm just saying like this was the belief. And we saw the dissolution of a belief system whenever the Berlin Wall fell, when communism started to fall. And the previous rulers of Russia that had been more tied to the Soviet Union also fell. But something interesting has happened since then. And a very specific person has come into power over Russia. I can't even make this part up. Okay, we're going to go back to the charts. We're going to get rid of Berlin and we're going to look at Vladimir Putin. By the way, this chart information came from astrotheme.com. This is where I'm getting this information. So October 7th, 1952, 9:30 a.m., St. Petersburg. This man is a Gemini moon, Libra sun, Scorpio rising. Look, not all Scorpio risings are the same. And if there's a difference, it's the difference between me and this man right here very quickly. But I think it's interesting that he had the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. He's not the only person we're going to talk about in this time frame. But I wanted to show his chart for just a minute. Because, again, historically speaking, since the 1800s, when certain things happened with Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, they had a direct impact to the shifts around Russia and Russia's government. Thought that was interesting. Not wishing for anything, just telling you, I got my eyes on that. And anytime that hits the news, I'm kind of curious because historically speaking, something always happens. Whether it was the fall of the monarchy, what was happening on with Alexander II, the death of Joseph Stalin, and how there was a stark difference in how communism continued in the country from there, the fall of the Berlin Wall that happened in 1989, and the fact that now that we're going into another Saturn-Neptune conjunction, the ruler of Russia has a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in his chart. Isn't that curious? So curious. Now, I'm going to use him as a segue. I'm not focused on him. I don't want to talk about him. I don't want to get hurt. I still think I'm going to get flagged by all the little AI bots and all that because of the content of this episode. And I already know I have a shadow ban of some sort going on YouTube because they hate showing my videos for whatever reason. Spotify tends to be a lot more friendlier for me. For me. Your individual ideas of Spotify is a different thing. Now, I want to talk about the generational element. And this kind of can put some things into perspective for a lot of people. Again, Vladimir Putin, 1950s. He's not the only one that I actually have his chart from the 1950s. So let's pick on somebody else. I'm going to use his chart too. Somebody that I also pay attention to because anybody that knows me knows that I watch the business news before I watch anything else. We're going to pick on Jerome Powell because he also has the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in his chart. So for moving forward from here, if we pick on somebody from the 1950s, we're going to pick on Jerome Powell. I don't think that he's going to care. I think he's going to be curious that somebody's paying attention, but I don't think he's going to care with what I'm saying next. I want to go with the generational efforts of what's going on with some of the boomers and what we're seeing now. And some of these people that were born in the 1940s and the 1950s, they have two very specific placements. One that we just focused on, Neptune and Libra. Yes, there's the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. I'm not going away from that. Just humor me for just a second. They have Neptune in Libra, but many of them also have Pluto in Leo. And generationally speaking, the boomers are in their oppositions. They are either starting their Neptune opposition by sign, or they are starting their Pluto opposition by sign. These boomers that were born in an indoctrinated, propagandized nuclear delusion vibration, and that's what they were taught from their early days, are now in a very different vibration because society has changed, but it has not changed in the way that they were told that it was going to change. They still believe the propaganda that they were raised to believe in the 1950s, because that's what it was. The white picket fence, the American dream, the nuclear family, the blah, 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 blah. All of that was a form of propaganda. It was. And now these people are seeing what's happening in society. And by their birth chart, they're adamantly against the way the world is changing. Many of them, not everybody. They're adamantly against it. Because again, these generational planets of Pluto and Neptune are now in the opposite sign. They believe that you're supposed to want to have strong forms of power, Pluto and Leo. They believe that we're supposed to do all of these things to keep things righteous and balanced, Neptune and Libra. But it's the delusion of the balance. They don't necessarily see themselves as anyone that tips the balance. I say this as somebody that listens to certain people of these generations that are still tied to the old belief system. And for the younger ones, I hope this makes sense as to like why they act the way they do. This is what they're ingrained with. This is the propaganda they were taught. This is the lessons that they were taught, that you're supposed to do these things. And again, this was the time frame of the Cold War. They're used to this kind of friction. That was the entirety of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, all the way into the 80s. Friction. we're supposed to be adamantly against certain things. And when suddenly over the last 3 decades, like we were not adamantly against the same things in the same way anymore, well, that doesn't feel right to them because they spent decades only knowing this kind of friction, this kind of thing that they're supposed to be adamantly against. We're not supposed to want to take care of everybody. That's not the bill of goods that we were taught when we were kids. I'm saying this from the boomer standpoint, not whenever I was a kid. I don't know what the hell I was taught. Now, we had the nuclear delusion. We've had the shifts in power, the shifts in reigning power, beliefs around what should be controlled and who should have control over it. And now I want to tie some things back to the present. Let's think back to what we talked about with the War of Spanish Succession and the Queen Anne's War, and the fact that there were so many fights over land, taxes, resources, and gold. Well, if you think of another way to say gold in more modern terms, we're going to go back to the 1950s for a second. Think of the Beverly Hillbillies. And what did we learn from the intro of that little show? Yeah, black gold, Texas tea, oil is considered black gold. One of the main resources based for why the War of Spanish Succession was so important was because of gold. That was the primary resource that people were going after. So there's that. We are dealing with an aging population that were taught a form of propaganda that we were all supposed to work to have a certain element of power over other people. We're supposed to have power over other people. So they don't see what's wrong or right because their moral belief system was taught to be different than the way many of us are taught today. There's a very big mental dynamic between the boomer kids of the 1950s and 60s that were taught what they were taught versus the 90s and 2000s kids that were taught a whole different vibration. They had participation trophies. Everybody was supposed to be treated equal. Everybody needs to support each other. Everybody needs to be more fair. If we're not being fair, then there's a problem. People get excluded. We don't want to exclude people. There's a mentality shift generationally. And the participation trophy kids, so for those that want to be like, Dusty, you're saying something negative. I'm not. Those are the kids that are now coming into power, that they're now becoming adults and they're now making adult decisions. And they're looking at it as we're supposed to support each other. We're supposed to help each other. Now, there's some that they still can go with the leads of their ego. And I understand that. We're not getting into individuals at this time. I'm more focused on like the generational aspects of certain time frames. There are huge, stark differences in the belief systems of the 1950s Saturn-Neptune conjunction people versus the 1990s Saturn-Neptune conjunction people. There's a firm difference between the younger millennials going into the Gen Z kids. I know you guys aren't kids. I know. I'm sorry. Little brothers, little sisters. Do your thing. Now we have to talk about the unrest around people in positions of power. And again, if we look at the timeline of the War of Spanish Succession, there were fights as to who should be in control of what. And there was a lot of fueled belief that I should have more control than them, and they can't be getting more gold than me, and they can't be richer than me, and they can't have that stuff. I want that stuff. I'm supposed to have that stuff, so I'm going to take that stuff. You think of the 1800s, whenever there was the attempt to reform the law. And as soon as we had the second son that had not been taught by his father to also believe in certain things, that he was taught to be a monarch as in like a grand archduke, and we're put in this position by God, and we tear up the reforms, and we don't want to do something that disrupts the balance of power. It creates an opening for a further disruption later. And that came. And again, we see huge disruptions in power the next time we have a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And that was the one in the 19 teens, where the Russian monarchy was overthrown. And we went into the first vibrations around communism. But this was following World War I. What I didn't cover is this wasn't the only disruption that happened in the World War I time frame. At the end of World War I, multiple monarchies fell. We lost the German monarchy. We lost the Austrian monarchy. We lost half of the royal families. And countries were forced to create new governments outside of a monarchy. The monarchies were cut in half in the 19 teens. I didn't really cover that part, but it's the truth. Cousins fought. There were victors, and the ones that lost the war literally lost their land, lost their titles, lost their countries that they felt they were entitled to. Huge shift and redrawing areas of power. In the 1950s, we had the fueling belief system. We had different forms of propaganda that started to take over society that literally still gets spoken to this day. The nuclear family, the white picket fence, the American dream. We understood by any means necessary, because the only way to stay in power, sometimes by it means doing things that we wouldn't necessarily do, that wouldn't necessarily be supported. And by any means necessary became a very big tagline through the spy games. I didn't really call it the spy games earlier. I'm calling it spy games now. But the spy games is a concept that supports that James Bond era. And again, James Bond was created during a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. By any means necessary. When it goes into the 1989 to 90 timeframe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the belief that capitalism won. We're the greatest. America is the greatest. How many times have you heard that? It's also a form of propaganda. We won. We know what we're doing. We should have control of everything. America's super cocky. America is the only nation that tries to have an embassy in every country. There's a delusion around power, around control, because America won and they became such a huge, dominant superpower. They became a policing system. For many countries, America has been a policing system. But now we're in a different mentality. And the beliefs around the rules are changing. They are. And I said that this was going to happen 2 years ago. I could see it then. It was specifically during another Meditative Rant video that focused more on Mars, Pluto, and what I was picking up on at that time. And now we've recently had another Mars-Pluto conjunction that kind of like closed out the tie from that one. But I can see the dominance. Now we're going into this new vibration of Saturn and Neptune in Aries. And if we compare it to the 1700s, there was a fueling that we had to do anything to control resources, gold, trade. There's a lot of despicable things that started to occur during that time frame to have control and to have power. Whenever it comes to history, Saturn and Neptune conjunctions rewrite the rules. And that's why so many people are struggling with what's going on right now. Because historically speaking, we're not used to rewriting the rules, rewriting the laws. That's not what many of us have dealt with. Some have. That's why I was showing some of the charts that I was. And the reason I have that chart for Jerome Powell, by the way, because I was picking on him. I didn't really pick on him, but I used him as my example because I didn't want to use Putin. I didn't really want to keep using Putin. Is when we look at what's going on in the Fed right now and capping interest rates, Jerome Powell has been adamantly against making the changes that someone else has been trying to push onto him. He has fought all the way through, not doing it. But his term is coming to an end. And there is going to be somebody else that does not fight the same way he does. Now, for some of us, that could be a good thing. That could actually end up showing a huge boost to the economy. Potentially, I'm not promising that. The negative could be he was a barrier trying to maintain the old belief system. And once it is completely dismissed, outgrown, removed, that the next fueling that comes through and fuels, if it's not riches, it could be inflation. It could go into the negative just as much as it could be the positive. Not promising either way. I have thought Jerome Powell has been very important for his role in the Fed for a while. And that's why, again, I created a chart for him just so I could just kind of look at that. But I also see a pattern with the people from that generation and how they're adamantly against so much of where society is at right now. And it feels like for the collective, we're watching the end of a narcissistic relationship. This is my way of looking at it. And I've described this to a couple of people, but I feel like this is the best way to kind of describe it. We're seeing the decline, the final grab to control as somebody's leaving a narcissistic partnership. The narcissist is trying to control the narrative. This is what we're supposed to do, and this is what was said, and this is how it's supposed to be. We're going to go back to the old ways, and it's going to be great. I promise. Just listen to me. How many times in the past did the narcissist promise to change and promise to do something different, and then they go back to their normal narcissistic behavior? And we have the little versions of flying monkeys. Well, I'm not going to name them in regards to the news or anything right now, but I'm pretty sure some of y'all are going to figure it out. Don't you believe him? Don't you believe everything that he promised? He promised. He promised us. Why wouldn't you believe his promises? It's just so important. Just believe what he's saying. Believe what's going on. You just got to have hope. But anyone that doesn't believe the flying monkeys, that knows the pattern of the narcissist, many of us are looking at what's going on. And if you think about it now, that you're really going to think about it now, it's like watching a narcissist going through a breakup, doing everything to grab a power, to grab control. And I'm saying this is the collective. I'm not saying this is one person. I'm not blaming any one particular leader. I'm actually saying this by generation. The prior generation is doing a last-ditch effort to control everything that they can, fuel everything that they can. But ultimately, they're going to die. Actually, I'm going to say it that way. I mean, they're aging out. Like, I'm not wishing anything negative. I'm being realistic. These people are aging out. And as that number dwindles, it's going to force a reset in the collective. It's going to force a reset. And that old nuclear delusion is going to die away with the people that used to have it. They still believe the 1950s is possible. They do not want to believe anything but the lie and the delusion that they were promised their entire lives. That 50s propaganda of the American dream, of the nuclear family, the white picket fence. And this is the way everything's supposed to go, Johnny boy. It's so great. We were fine with segregation. We weren't, but anyways, there's a reason that we're seeing the energies that we are from the collective. And I feel like it's a last-ditch effort to control before control completely dissolves. Saturn conjunct Neptune. Now, I don't think it's going to dissolve in one day, in one transit. Most historically speaking, everything had a large time frame of a good 5-year span, 2.5 to 3 before, 2.5 to 3 afterwards. Some of those Saturn Neptune conjunction time frames, there was more than one conjunction. There was like waves of 3. In this time frame, there's one. And I'm just focusing on the fact that we're going into it this spring. Now, I know this can be a little jumbled and I do jump around a little bit, and there are reasons for that. But I've wanted to kind of put forth this knowledge for a while because, again, history repeats itself. But what we don't pay attention to is when history is repeating itself, what transit is also repeating. We are in a repeat of a transit that happened in the 1700s, Saturn conjunct Neptune. We are in a repeat of a transit that speaks to an undoing of a prior generation. And there's going to be a lot of people that are like, I don't know that I agree with that. And I get that. But there's a reason so many of the older generation are in this response of fear towards all of the change. They were taught to fear the unknown, that the only way that is right is the way that they've been taught. And they were not taught to be open-minded. They were not taught to question. They were not taught to learn outside of the rules that was themselves. And if you think back to whenever we were talking back in October, and I was talking about like the going to Technicolor, Pleasantville vibration. That show was set in the 1950s, that Pleasantville vibration. The black and white show was set in the 50s. There's a reason why some of those time frames or why we're seeing the pattern repeat. That's because Saturn Neptune was in the 50s. There's a nostalgia, there's a dissolution, there's a fueling, there's a belief change. How individual people respond makes the difference of the fueling. It makes the difference of the belief. Some people, the belief that we start to go in from here is going to be political. For some people, it is going to be religious. It is going to be spiritual. For some people, it is going to be a very big shift in their moral compass, their moral dynamic. Shifts in society. The rules are being rewritten. Neptune comes through like the Tasmanian devil and pulls all the feathers off the duck. Saturn happens to be the duck this time, trying to put things back together and realizing once certain things are undone, we can't put them back the same way. I feel like part of this was a jumbled mess. A lot of this stuff has been in my head for quite some time. And I did try to show different things. I didn't show you everything. Like I didn't show you everything from Wikipedia. I did show you the majority of the charts that I had created, just kind of like corresponding the time frames. I know there's going to be questions. I'd be happy to talk to anybody additionally further from this. But I wanted to go into like that repeat of the pattern to show why we're seeing such a big discomfort in what's going on in society. And that's because a lot of the prior beliefs are being dissolved. Some of the rules are being rewritten. And some people are very much in the mindset that whatever we do to succeed should be done by any means necessary. And if you're watching what's going on in the news, on social media, in the world, that terminology should make a lot of sense. It doesn't excuse anything, it just explains it. And it gives you an idea of the timeline of how crazy this is going to be. And really, I don't feel like we start to hit another wave of calm. And I'm very loose on the verbiage of calm, by the way, until like 2028 and 2029. I really feel like there's a fueling while we're, especially with Saturn and Aries, while we're going through these next few years. But we're also going to see a very big rewrite in the rules, in the beliefs, in the moral compass of many, many people. And many people are going to also be fueled by their new belief system moving forward. I hope that helps. Okay. I love and appreciate every single one of you. I will talk to everybody very, very soon. Subscribe.